Okay. I'm gonna, it's Dame's Place, Dame Stories. Please like, subscribe, look back at the other stories. There's a lot of stuff on. I'm an old lady and I worked in a bar, a hospital, and a prison, and like a number of bars and a number of places to like always working with people. So I have lots of people experience. So I like to tell stories. I'm working on a story for Saturday, which is about my Uncle Tom Cahoon, which was kind of what led me to doing all this research in about 2020 when probably everybody did. But there was like a family tragedy where his body, a funeral director was charged and went to prison, and my uncle was one of the people that his body wasn't where it was supposed to be buried at the Bath VA cemetery. So I'm telling all these stories about how I remember growing up in Rochester. I grew up in Florida, in Rochester and Batavia and Indian Falls, basically. These are all little places, little towns. Rochester's pretty big. So this is a Rochester story about my grandpa. Oh, that looked like maybe a swallow. See him? I hope it's not a bat. It looks like a bat. Watch towards the light and see if you see a bat come through. Anyway, and the moon's up in the tree. I don't know if you can make it out. Let's see. There it is right there. See it? Boop. I'm going to keep my eye on that bat, though. I don't want to look away. Okay. So, when I lived in Rochester, I sold flowers with my cousin, the Lorraine, which are really Kumanales. They changed their name. That was a story about my aunts, because this is how my family all like did some scheme and made a deal with the city, I'm sure, some kind of way. I don't know how, but you're just like trying to figure it out when they gaslight you and you don't know. But I'll tell you about a life of gaslighting, because you had to kind of just like where I lived and everything, you had to, you were told that, not to talk about things like, oh, look at Kitty. Hi, girl. You barely see her. Kitty. Say hi. Can't see, it's too dark. So you were told not to talk about things, but I'm going to tell you the stories, and I hope someday my daughter sees, because she doesn't know these stories. She grew up with her father's family, and my family was already pretty much gone by the time she's just a little girl. She barely knew her uncle or my father and her grandfather. So I am the only person of those stories. And when you're living in trauma like that and everybody's telling you your people are, they're all dead and they're like not good. And, I know what good men they were. I know what good people they were. But when you're surrounded with a lot of people that don't think that or try to treat you as such, like it doesn't matter, they're gone. You're kind of like, as a girl with no one around, you're stuck with that, sort of, and I couldn't be more, I didn't want to push my daughter when there really wasn't anything to show her, because my father had died and my uncle had died and my grandpa. So I just let that go and let her stay with those people, because I wasn't going to fight him in court. He got partial custody, and that was how it was, and there was more of them than me. So that was why that led to not looking into things too deeply at the time. When my uncle died. But anyway, okay, so going back, when I worked, I'm going to tell that other story about when I worked at the prison, and my uncle went in, and he worked with those men, Tommy Torpy and Tommy Taylor. Those were mob guys from Rochester that worked for Sammy Ginginello, and there was a war, and then they blew him up. Not those guys, those were his bodyguards. They lived. And then they wanted to go off in their own faction, like the C team, and the A and B team were fighting, and that was in the 80s into the 90s. And when I graduated high school, when I was a little girl, I lived in a storefront on Monroe Avenue. My father had sold like mattresses out of there, and we just had like a hot plate and a little, like you got in a this like utility sink back there, and a hot plate and all these mattresses and like a couple bedrooms, but they were like, this was rough living. And then this is in this time when I'm going to tell you the story, these early 80s. This is 81, 82, maybe 80, 81, 82, when I'm on the run kind of with my father. Not all those years, because I went to different schools then as well, but there was a whole time when this is going on with this stuff that I'm living in Rochester. My father is, like they would leave you back then. I would go to a bowling lane with my friends. We would just walk over to bowling lane and just watch watch people bowl. We'd walk over there and crossing Winton Road on a bridge, and that's a big thing. Two like 8 to 10-year-olds and a 13-year-old boy, her brother. But anyway, and I would walk and hang out with my cousin, that Lorraine. She's a Lorraine, which they're not really Lorraine, they're Cumanels. That's her real name, but they hide it. Their father changed it because he left his first family and then he went with Lorraine. So, where was I? Okay, so I would go to those farms. I went to that farm in Scottsville, not the I think is his name Valentini? I should know that right now, but I'm getting them mixed up now. But the guy from Pittsburgh or somewhere that was taking over Rochester, and he was kicking out Magadino from Buffalo in the mob stories that I'm telling. I was at a different farm, but this guy owned a club. He owned Diamonds Club, which then was indicted. Or maybe they weren't indicted there, but there's nothing there now, and it's just like it's like a lot. A lot of these places are. The Blue Gardenia they talk about, you'll see it in my posts on Attica Prison Stories, Survivor Stories, and on Attica Prison Stories is mine too. It's an old account. I'm locked out of it. There's nothing I can do on that. And Dame's Place, Time Ben 2025 on Instagram and YouTube. There's posts on it. So I was at those places. I was at all these bars, different bars. My father would run out, and he was a weed guy, and he grew weed, and he would go out and get people's weed. But at one time we left the city, and they were testing me for school, and I wasn't talking after my mother had died. And I had seen that, and that's what cognitive dissonance will make you not see it. So I didn't remember how my mother died, and I had convinced myself of another story, and I didn't figure it out until I had tripped one time, like my second time tripping at 17 after a Dead show, a Grateful Dead show, and I just sat there, and I just remembered what I had seen, and it was horrific, yeah, but it released me. I didn't see my mother on the side of the road asking for a ride or feeling like, oh, maybe she just ran off, That's what you convince yourself when you're a little kid, that your parents not really, really gone, and they just didn't like their life, and they went to start a better one, and they'll be back. That's what I thought. Well, I thought that with my Uncle Tom, too. Right up until this year. I'd say it was maybe not this year, last year, when I said, okay, he's not alive anymore. But this thing with this funeral director and never finding his body and all the things I had to research. And my uncle was a good guy. He wasn't like just this mob guy bookie. That wasn't his main claim to fame. He was for Irish people's rights, and he was very religious. Not religious in the way of he's not hitting you over the head with his religion. He's spiritual. He believes in God and Jesus and Mary, and he believes in the story that you live it, and it's just a way of living. And for that, he was involved in a lot of different things. He lived in Leavenworth. He stayed at Abby's. There was a lot of clandestine things, I think. Most of the time, though, they seemed like personal renewal and, drying out. He had he didn't have a drug problem. He had an alcohol problem, but he ended up with a drug problem. He was a vet, and they, gave him every pill in the world, and he took them up and down. And, he had almost died a year before he died. He was in a terrible car accident. And he was on life support for 3 months at ECMC in Buffalo, and on a life support. They were saying we might have to amputate his legs and arms, and his heart, can't pump. My cousin, this terrible cousin in Rochester, I'm saying he wouldn't want to live like that. He wouldn't want to live like that with no arms and no legs. And she's like, you have no idea the value of life. Does he not have a brain and a heart and soul? This is in front of people that were basically losing their kid to gunshot. Gang violence at ECMC in the ICU waiting room. It was absolutely insane, that I'm having to do this with her. I got a little kid that's, sitting with, probably her dad might have watched her for me. I literally had to look at it like that. He might have watched her for me because he wasn't around much reliably. And I had to be up at that hospital. My uncle was in that hospital in the ICU for 3 months at least that summer, and they would call me at Attica and say, he's getting his last rites. We don't think he's going to make it. You're going to have to get up here. We're going to say goodbye. And I kept doing that, and I kept doing that. Every week I did. It seemed like maybe 3 or 4 times over that summer until he came out of it. He just ended up miraculously coming out of it with I think a $1.5 million bill or something like that from ECMC for all the life support that the VA didn't cover it. They didn't have that kind of service, but that was his bill, and he was just he'd had a traumatic brain injury from that accident. He had saved a man's life, taken him to the Veterans Hospital. He had had a heart attack, and the wife had called my uncle to help him in Darien. They lived in Darien, and he picked him up in Darien, drove him to the hospital, the VA, and they saved him. And on his way back, he put his car in a ditch, and it pierced his appendix, and the poison went through him. And he laid on someone's couch and took pills and drank for a couple of days. And then finally they called me and said, listen, he's not like cognizant. And I was at work at Attica Prison, and I said, call 911 and take him to Buffalo or Rochester. Take him to Buffalo, it was closer. And so that's what they did. And that went on for an entire summer. So I didn't look into things too deeply about what was going on at that point, but I'll leave it there because I got neighbors out and I don't want to bother them. And I've put up, this will be my third video. So watch the other ones, Instagram, Dame's Place, and on YouTube, Dame's Place, Time Bend 2025. All right. Thanks for listening. Have a great night. Check out the moon.